Everybody knows it's not that easy to go patch stuff in these environments. So today I want to talk about a different way to start targeting these to try and take a kind of more risk-based approach rather than just hunting after your critical and high CVSS score vulnerabilities, which again I think has been a very big challenge that I've personally seen in environments as we're getting out there. So today I'll start with just kind of the current state, what I've seen and what Clarity's seen of oil and gas in general. Like, why are we doing this? Obviously everybody's here for HuSecCon, so we all care about security. But some of the trends that we've been seeing that have been driving us to this, right? We need to start taking more action in the vulnerability space and the risk space. Then I'm going to start explaining kind of the idea of exposure management versus traditional vulnerability management. Again, I'll dig in a lot on this, but this is basically the idea of focusing more on where an attacker would actually leverage into your environment. Rather than just going after random vulnerabilities, if I was to actually come after your environment as a red team or something like that, where were the areas that I would attempt to leverage to be able to get into that environment and tackle those areas first. And then we'll talk through that journey, right? There's kind of a continuous process we can do as we start building in these programs. Hopefully give you guys some ideas on how we could take these back to our own environments as we're coming back to our day jobs. And yeah, then I'll leave some room at the end for some Q&A. So, as was said, I'm Gary. I'm one of our principal product managers here in Clarity. I've been in the OT cyberspace for closing in on 18 years now. I came from the system side, so I was an electrical engineer. I wasn't oil and gas, I was power. I came from a nuke, but I was there when the cyber regs passed in nuclear power plants in the United States. So I'm very familiar, all you midstream folks that are struggling with TSA, I really feel for you. I had to go through the same thing. My group absorbed it, and we were all of a sudden all cyber engineers, even though I was an electrical engineer, and got to deal with all of that. After that, I worked at Schneider Electric, and then I've been at Clarity for about 8 years. So I've been doing this for a while, seen a lot of different environments, been heavily in oil and gas and a lot of other critical infrastructure. And again, I focus a lot more on the practitioner side of things, just having had to deal with this in the day-to-day when I was system engineer and when I was at Schneider working with a lot of different customers. So, what is the current state that we're seeing? I'm sure this is kind of preaching the choir. This is the sort of stuff that you guys see. But when we talk about why we're even doing this, right? Obviously, we see a lot of legacy systems out there. Every one of you guys see that in your own environments, right? A lot of old stuff, Windows XP all over the place. I have only ever seen a working token ring system in a refinery, so there is a lot of old gear that is out there across our oil and gas infrastructure. Also, one of the most unique things I think about this space is it is highly targeted. I think especially recently with some of the geopolitical stuff going on, like we've seen this targeting, especially certain geopolitical targets. So it is something that doesn't just have to worry about just random drive-by stuff, like you actually do have nation-state type things that you have to worry about. And architectures are incredibly complex. Again, any of you guys with large footprints know upstream, midstream, and downstream are all very different. It's also something that makes vulnerability management incredibly difficult, right? If you're gonna go try and patch a system that is on a pipeline that is in the middle of nowhere in Canada or something, right? That's not easy to do. These aren't things that we can just go target and quickly and easily get done when we're out there. The other big thing that we're seeing is increase in attacks in this space. So again, a lot of this is stuff that I'm sure you're aware of, but we've seen more and more of these types of things that are actually targeting our operational areas. Right, so things like Saudi Aramco, Colonial Pipeline, the DESFA attack, right? Even if these aren't targeting specifically our OT, they are having major impacts on operations that I think is changing how boards and companies are starting to look at these sort of things. I think this is also a great example of why we need to focus more on exposure and the inputs into our operational environment that an attacker can utilize. Colonial is a great example where it's the connections between these networks that are the real issue. It wasn't some random critical or high vulnerability that existed on a piece of equipment. It was that you had these pathways between these environments that lead to a much higher risk, a much higher attack path that could be leveraged or, accidentally used, in this case from an IT to an OT attack. And this is kind of where that mindset comes from, right? We don't need to be focusing on just these, again, these random higher critical vulnerabilities. We want to focus on where are the weakest parts of our network, where are the areas that an attacker would utilize, or where is the highest risk, right? Internet-connected devices, outbound connectivity, all that sort of things. These are the type of things that when we're starting to talk exposure management, we want to have in the front of our minds. The other big thing is regulation. Again, all of you guys in midstream, I'm sure, are very, very, very aware of this, but obviously we have the new TSA directives. A lot of you guys with large geopolitical footprints know NIS2 is making changes in the European Union. We're seeing it in Australia with the SOCI Acts, new CISA CPGs. I also think this is going to continue going in this direction, right? We're dealing with this in midstream. I unfortunately think, like all of critical infrastructure, is going to have some government intervention at some point. I think it's accelerating, it's not decelerating. So for all you guys, this is stuff that we can start thinking about right when we're building our programs up, and especially in this, managing vulnerabilities, managing exposures, managing risk. These are all parts of all these different frameworks. So as we're building this out, we need to think, even if you're not today dealing with a regulator, you may be dealing with one in 5 years, 10 years, or maybe an industry group that we have to start contributing to. So these are all things that, again, we need to start thinking about as we're working through these problems. So that's some of the table stakes, but I've mentioned a couple of times in here some of the problems that I see with traditional OT vulnerability management, but let's actually get into some numbers here. So if you look at all of the vulnerabilities that exist for assets out there, there are millions of vulnerabilities, right? Like if you go look at CISA, you go look at the vulnerability database, there are tons and tons and tons and tons of vulnerabilities. And let's say your organization is just going to prioritize based on CVSS, right? We look at our org, we're going to say, we're just going to look at the high and critical vulnerabilities. That'll take us down from this list of 20 million OT vulnerabilities down to a manageable number. What does that make that manageable number? That takes it down to about 25% of all those vulnerabilities. So we're still looking at, 4 to 5 million vulnerabilities. I don't know how many of you guys are dealing with this on a day-to-day thing, but if I gave you a list of 5 million things to remediate, you would probably give me some expletives, some things, and are you out of your mind? Some of that sort of stuff. So this obviously is too challenging if we just look at this. And again, I'm sure you guys have seen this in your own estates. This is too challenging just to look at for CVSS. The other thing is if we're only looking at CVSS, you are potentially missing vulnerabilities that are much more risky. CVSS gets calculated once at the time of disclosure. And for a lot of these things, we're talking about Windows XP. We're talking about systems that are 20 years old, right? You're talking about vulnerabilities that got disclosed 10, 15, 20 years ago, where things could be dramatically different, right? Your network looks a lot different than it did 20 years ago. So if we just add on a couple of different filter things here and look at just assets that are on the known exploited vulnerability list, right? Today, CISA pulls together all the actual exploits that have been done against vulnerabilities in the wild. They pull from a bunch of different data sources, from all the US government sources they pull in. They also pull from a bunch of industry groups. So if we just look at that, right, if we just say these are what actual attackers are using in the wild, it takes that 20 million number and looks at just 1.3% of that. So there is a very small percentage of vulnerabilities that actually get exploited, actually get attacked by real attackers. And just applying this one filter gets us down to a dramatically lower number than using that traditional, CVSS of critical or high. We can take that number and bring it down a lot. This is also something where you may have what we call the vulnerability blind spot. And if you look at that 1.3% of known exploited vulnerabilities, 43% of them would not be in that critical or high method that I was talking about before. So you may have vulnerabilities that attackers have been using, that have known attacks that they can utilize in the wild, that have active attack campaigns that are going on right now. And because you're using that traditional VM, let's just look at the crits and highs, you're missing those. So these are real things that an attacker could use in your environment. And again, that traditional VM play will miss those items. We also have a lot of these where you have higher risk potential into the environment, right? If we're just looking at these, again, it takes this really big number, brings it down to something more manageable, and will cover us on some of these blind spot items. So this gives us that first little filter that we're looking through, and this kind of starts that exposure management idea, right? What we're looking for is what is exploitable. What could an actual attacker use to come into my environment? And using that to drive our remediation actions rather than looking, again, just for critical or highs or trying to check the box to say we're going out there and patching stuff. We want to focus on things that are going to move the needle and going to seriously reduce the risk to our organization by going after some of these broader things, again, like things that are on the known exploited vulnerability list. The other big thing here, if we look at the just the numbers here, and this is coming from CISA and some of the other folks out there that do a lot of vulnerability research, zero-day vulnerabilities are very rarely the cause of a breach. Like if you go look at the real attacks that have happened in real environments out in the field, like actual operational environments, it's usually not some novel zero-day, like, yes, there's stuff like Stuxnet, and yes, there's stuff like, you know, some of these nation-state type things. But day-to-day, the things that we're seeing a lot is something that has already been exploited in the past and is part of either an ongoing attack campaign or something that attackers have already leveraged through some previous means in the past. Also, only 2 to 7% of vulnerabilities are ever actually exploited. So again, out of that list of millions of vulnerabilities that are out there, there's a fraction of those that actually get exploited in the wild. So if we put those together, that gives us an idea of real attacks that have either occurred in the past or could continue occurring in the future. And again, reduces the scope of what we're looking at dramatically, reduces it to a much, much smaller number of what we need to be focusing on. The other big thing here is traditional vulnerability management does not account for broader exposures than attack vectors. So even super simple things here, right? Internet connectivity. If you have a device that is connected to the internet directly and has a bunch of medium CVSS vulnerabilities on it that have been exploited in the wild, that is way more critical to your business than a Windows XP host that is, you know, not connected to anything, that is sitting off by itself that nobody can get to. Right? We actually need to account for some of these other things so that we can focus on the true riskiest areas, the true biggest issues in our plant. The final thing here is that traditional vulnerability management doesn't consider business outcomes, right? If we're just doing this to kind of check the box or to say that, hey, we're doing something, we can go up to the board and say we have this line trending downwards because we patched X number of systems in the past year or whatever. What we really need to focus on is what is the business case we care about here? Why are we even doing this, right? The whole point of this is to reduce risk to your operations. We're not just doing it to check a box. We want to make sure that an attacker can't get into our environment in the first place, or if they do, we can limit the exposure of what they're doing to specific systems or to make it so it's not going to be a whole business impacting event that occurs through our environment. So all these things, again, if you're taking nothing else from this, just take that there are better ways, right? And I think, again, if many of you have already started on this vulnerability management track, you've probably run into some of these challenges. You've probably run into some of the, hopefully some of what I'm saying is resonating with you. But there's a lot of evidence out there to also show that the traditional way of doing these is something that we need to change, right? We need to start doing this in a better, more targeted way that at the end of the day is going to help our business outcomes and drive to better results for our organizations. So, what are we going to do about it? So I've talked a lot about some of the challenges. What is this new idea that we want to do? So this idea of exposure management is not something that's new. This is something that Gartner's been doing for a while, but basically what it is it's an idea of creating a consistent and repeatable process that will actually reduce the risk to your organization in a kind of procedural way. So we have this flywheel here that kind of goes through the idea of how we go through this. And it is intended to be something that we do over and over and over again, right? We start here, we try and work our way through, we identify what we're gonna target in the scoping phase, we figure out how we're actually gonna find those devices through discovery, we prioritize what we found, then we go out and actually do it, right? We validate that those changes can be made, and then we go make them in the field. Then we come back and review these results, right? I'll go into a lot more detail on all these, but at a high level, that's basically the idea. We say, hey, we're gonna just start by targeting our most critical systems, right? Anything that's internet connected that has a known exploited vulnerability on it, right? That's gonna be our starting place. We go out, find all the systems, figure out how to remediate them, either change their configuration, patch them, whatever it needs to be. We're just gonna hit our lowest hanging fruit. After that, we come back to the start, say, great, fist bumps, high fives for everybody, we did a great thing. What's our next target, right? Now that we've done this, what is our next highest outlier of risk that we need to start going after? So it's intended to be a repeatable process, something that we continually do. It's kind of a continuous improvement thing to always be targeting what is our highest risk into the organization in a more manageable way. So why are we doing this differently, right? Again, this is something that is not new. Again, Gartner's been doing this for a while, but it does need a different approach when we're talking for our OT systems. So again, exposure management's been happening on the IT side for a while, but when we are thinking OT, there's some different considerations we need to bring into play here. I'm sure a lot of this resonates with you guys, but things like for each of these environments, when we're actually looking for devices, right, when we're scoping problems, the types of issues that we're dealing with are very different, right? You may have to worry about very abnormal architectures, very obscure equipment, older stuff, or things that don't exist on the IT side. So we need to have something, a program that's going to take those items into account and properly account for the risk for all those things. Discover, I think, is one of the hardest things, right? If we're looking at traditional tools, I think that's why companies like Clarity exist, right? To help you identify and discover devices in your operational environments. If we don't have the information required, we're not going to be able to do these remediation activities. We're not going to be able to identify the appropriate areas to do this. So that is another reason why we need to have something a little bit more purpose-built for this. Prioritization is also something that's different. Again, in IT, we focus on confidentiality, right? Information security, that type of stuff. On OT, we need to work into work processes, right? You may not be able to go update things in certain times, right? You have to wait for outages. You have to get approval from the sites, all that sort of stuff that we need to bake into this process as we're building along. These last items on validating and mobilization, again, we need to make sure whatever we're doing, whatever remediation activities that we're partaking in, keep in mind those business objectives of keeping our sites running, right? We can't just go slap EDRs on everything. We can't just go update everything, take all our PLCs offline to go update them one day. We have to keep that stuff in mind. We have to make sure that we're not going to be harming operations or impacting production as we're going through this. So all of this, again, speaks to kind of some of the differences that we have in this environment and some of the things we need to think about as we're moving through. So let's actually walk through the process a little bit and see what this looks like if we're doing this for an operational environment. Again, hopefully what I've been talking about so far has gotten some heads nodding. You're like, hey, I like this idea. I got told I had to go patch all this stuff. It's really too tough. And we want to start doing this a different way. What does this actually look like in practice, right? If we're going to go implement in one of our environments, what does this look like from the actual operational side? So again, I talked about that flywheel before, but it kind of goes through this process, and we start up here with scoping. So the first things that we're normally going to do here is we want to assess our areas and really try and start defining some of our most critical systems and start defining what we want to do to reduce risk to those areas. So if we know these are our crown jewels, right? If we're starting and this is our first pass at this, maybe the first thing we're going to target is our most critical business systems, right? Our safety systems, anything that is super important for operations, anything that if we take this out, like it's going to have serious adverse impacts to our entire environment. And start by mapping those so that we can figure out what can we do to these to start with so that we can move the needle the most, right? If we reduce risk to these most critical systems, that'll help us much more than, again, just targeting random vulnerabilities. Then we need to figure out what we got. So we say, hey, we're going to go after these safety systems, these specific networks, maybe these specific sites because there are most critical environments. Then let's go figure out what I got there, right? I need to be able to gather data in those environments. I need to get enough data to be able to identify if they have these, exposures or whatever. So usually that means I need to be able to see how devices are talking. I want to figure out, at a minimum, things like internet connectivity, right? I want to see where devices are communicating out. Being able to understand those pathways, I think, is super critical for this. And I need to be able to attribute vulnerabilities, right? If I'm going to go off, let's just say, known exploited vulnerabilities, right? I'm going to start there. I need enough information on these devices to be able to correlate those vulnerabilities. So on Windows stuff, that usually means I need to know like what patches are installed, what KBs, what programs. On PLCs, RTUs, sensors, that sort of stuff, usually that means I need like a firmware version, right? I need to know enough detail about it to be able to actually attribute that data. After that, let's start prioritizing. So now I've figured out my scope. I said, hey, as a business, we're going to target these devices, these systems, these specific sites because they're our most critical. Gone out, got my data. I've said I got a pretty good lay of the land. I know what I got there. I've identified what my risks are in that site. Then we can start prioritizing. So again, we want to start with like some of the lowest hanging fruit here. Things like internet connected devices, things with unsecure remote access software. Like we see that unfortunately all the time, but like harvested credentials to TeamViewer or something is still a big deal. Like it is a very real attack path. Even with all these advanced cybersecurity controls in place, right? You're still going to get defeated by that simple stuff. And then when we're talking vulnerabilities, target the things that are actually out there being utilized, right? Target those known exploited vulnerabilities. Target things that attackers are actually utilizing in attack campaigns so that we can start identifying that specifically. So from here, now we've got a pretty good idea on, hey, here's what we're going to go target. Here's what we're going to go do. Let's go start doing it, right? We'll actually go out there. We'll validate those systems actually exist as we think they do, get hands on them, make sure that they're actually in the configuration we think that they are, and go do the thing, right? Take off that remote access software, change its network config, update a system, patch it, take off a vulnerable program or something like that. Let's go implement it, and then we, again, start the process all over again. So after we do that, we get to do our high fives, say, great job, everybody. Now let's go after the next thing. Okay, we've targeted those critical systems. Let's start moving our way around and work through the process again. So that's from a little bit of a high level. If we go into, again, some of the more detailed discussions here, when we talk about scoping, a lot of times when I've talked to business about this, this is one of the things that I think we get a lot of challenges on, like, do we go by revenue value of the sites? Do we go by safety designation, right? Do we only go after safety systems? How do we do this? Usually, I like to talk about kind of where you're at in your journey and like where do you want to be, right? Like eventually, you're going to want to target XYZ systems. Eventually, you're going to want to target all your sites, maybe all your operational areas. Where are you going to start today? It's usually going to be, again, on some of the more critical things. We also need to talk about where we can actually get data here. So where can I actually where can I gather the information that I need to validate this stuff? And what sites can I do that at, right? Like maybe when you're targeting these, certain areas we're just not going to be able to get the information to actually validate this stuff because you don't have the personnel, we don't have the information on those sites, it's owned by another business unit or something like that. having some of those conversations can help us get more realistic about what we're actually going to do, right? Where are we going to start, because these are where we actually have the resources to do this work at. Another big one, again, compliance and regulations. Obviously, any of you guys in midstream or have those types of assets are thinking a lot about TSA. But if you're not, you could look at some of these other frameworks, right? I mean, everybody's probably looked at TSA and seen some of those, but there's a lot of others like IEC 62443, the NIST ESFs, NERC-CIP, if you like the energy stuff. All of them have different ways of kind of defining your critical assets, trying to identify where this is, and that's usually a good kind of starting point. And then if you do get regulated down the line, that at least gives us an important thing to follow. Also, audit requirements become very important. Again, if you are under these, you know there's lots of paper whenever auditors come around. And so you need to make sure whatever you're doing is going to produce the appropriate artifacts for that. So after scoping, then we need to start figuring out our discovery data. Again, this may even come into conversation during that scoping discussion. We may try and decide where we're targeting because I know where I can get data, right? I may have really good data on a certain part of our business, and from there, I know what I'll be able to go remediate. I know where I can identify my risks. And maybe for other areas, we need to do another project to figure out what's there before I can really start actually trying to reduce risk and reduce exposure. But usually from this, we need to look at what do we got. Again, if we look at, old style solutions, a lot of times it's Excel sheets, it's manual entries, it's limited understanding. That's usually where we want to come into something. Again, I always have to say clarity at least once in these presentations. That's where you come in, get something like us. We can come in, identify all this stuff, give you all the information you need, and be able to identify that information on these systems. And again, the most critical thing here is we need to identify the appropriate level of detail. If we're talking Windows stuff, we need to be able to get what patches are installed, what programs are installed. If we don't get that, I'm not going to be able to correlate vulnerabilities. On my OT stuff, firmware versions, like those become very important when we're actually trying to correlate information. So I need to get the appropriate level of detail on these devices to be able to do what I need to do. So after that, prioritization. Again, there's lots of different ways to do this. Here's an example of how Clarity does it, but there's a lot of different factors that we look at to try and identify risk. I've been talking about a lot of them already, but some of the big ones, I think the biggest ones are things like internet communication, where it sits in the network, right? What devices can get to the outside world. Those are almost always going to be good places to start. I just highly suggest we look at those ones first. It's also good to know you may have stuff that is internet connected that you don't realize is internet connected, right? System engineers have a great way of, especially if they don't like your remote access software, of throwing their own thing on there so they don't have to drive out to site, right? So being able to identify that and validate it becomes very important. We also look at things like other risk factors, right? If we have old systems, end-of-life stuff. Another important thing that you can look at here is compensating controls. Again, when we talk risk, if you have a device that has a bunch of vulnerabilities, but it's truly in a separate part of the network, we can validate that it doesn't have connectivity to any other systems. We know that we have other compensating controls in place. Taking credit for these things makes a lot of sense. We want to make sure when we're targeting our remediation actions that we're truly targeting the most critical areas, the areas where we're going to move the needle the most, right? The areas that we truly have the most exposed scenario, the area where an attacker would actually come in. So there's lots of different ways to do this. This is one of the ways that we do it, but this just gives you an idea on some of the things that you can look at as you're evaluating this within your own organizations. Then as we continue, again, one of the other things that we look at, we've talked a lot about different ways of kind of narrowing this down. I've mentioned known exploited vulnerabilities. That's something I think is a really great starting point because, again, it significantly narrows down vulnerabilities really quickly. Another one that I'd suggest looking into if you're a big vulnerability nerd and you love looking at CVSS scores and that sort of stuff all day, you probably already know about EPSS. That's the exploit prediction scoring system. This is something that actually looks how exploitable any specific vulnerability is. And the nice part about EPSS is it is a daily updated score. So again, while CVSS gets calculated once at the time of disclosure, EPSS continually gets updated. These are just a couple of metrics you can look at to really quickly filter down that list of vulnerabilities to something much more manageable, right? We can take that list of thousands, tens of thousands, down to something that could be hundreds or even less just by looking at a couple of these other methods or other metrics of bringing these down. So again, we've got a good idea. We're going to go out and start remediating this stuff. So now we want to go validate exposures. Again, there's lots of different ways to do this, but we want to make sure that we can go look in the field, see where we think we're going to go do stuff, make sure it actually exists, validate that our solutions weren't telling us the wrong things, get hands on some of this stuff, get people out in the field doing things. Another things that I see a lot of organizations leveraging more and more is extending some of their IT infrastructure into these environments. Again, you're not going to go run an EDR on a PLC or something like that, but if you have a jump box in the system that your engineers are using to get into the environment, that's probably a great place to have some more of your traditional IT tech stack in there, right? Like, yes, you don't want IT throwing that stuff on your HMIs or your critical systems, but there's a lot of stuff that exists in these environments now that is less, less operational critical as it used to be in the past. And those are good areas where we can extend at least some of this stuff to take credit for some of the controls that you guys have already started doing, right? Everybody has a million different things that you're doing on your corporate side. And having at least a little bit of that, I think, is a good way to both reduce risk and leverage some of that existing stuff that you're already doing. Final thing here is mobilizing. Again, I mentioned a couple different things here, but one of the things I always like to call out here is asset-centric hardening. One of the things I see a lot of people don't do is that many of your control systems today have security features in them, right? A lot of them support stuff like authentication. There are default passwords you can turn off or default accounts you can disable, right? There is stuff that you can do in a lot of your existing systems that you just have to go configure and actually do. So in a lot of cases, you may have security features and things that you can do on your existing equipment without having to go buy another solution that can significantly reduce your risk, like turning off certain ports, turning off certain protocols, right? Not with everything, right? Especially the older stuff doesn't support a lot of this stuff, but if you're getting anything that is even remotely recent, like it will probably have some of these baked in controls that you may just need to go enable to start taking credit for. So this is always one I always like to point out because you don't want to have to buy a new solution. It's never easy to go get money for this stuff. So if you can do it without having to do that, more power to you. Use what you already bought and get more work out of it. Also, I would highly suggest, I always like to say this to industry folks, you guys have a lot of power in the purchasing process. When you're buying new gear from Rockwell or from Schlumberger or from whoever, write it into the contracts. Tell them you are demanding some security, baseline of security in their products, right? The more that they get it from you guys and you guys control their budgets, right? You're paying into them. You force them to do better. So again, I came from Schneider. I remember us having like hard-coded root credentials and a bunch of stuff. Like that changes when industry forces it to change. So you guys have power here. I'd strongly suggest, use it, write it into your contracts, force your vendors to do better. So that's what we can do with asset-centric hardening. Also patching, obviously, right? There's updates that come out to this stuff, right? These are things that we can start doing now. Network-centric hardening is also one that I see it's one of the strongest compensating controls, putting in segmentation, restricting things. If you can't apply other controls, it can at least limit if something happens to a device, you can force it to just be in one part of the network. These are all things that we normally recommend, and these are some of the most common controls that we see folks applying. And so this kind of comes around to the whole circle. So after that, you figured out what we're going to do. We go implement it. We validate it. We document it. If you guys are regulated, you put it down, give it to your compliance team, and they go tell the regulator what a great job you guys are doing. And then we start it all over again. So then we go back to the start, we assemble our team like the Avengers, we figure out what we're gonna do, and then we go out and tackle it a second time. So it's unfortunately something that continues on forever, you know, like all things cybersecurity. You never get to, you know, chalk it up and say, we're done, guys, we're cyber secure. It is something that continually happens, but it lets you start targeting that lowest hanging fruit, the things that are gonna move the needle the most. I think it is a smarter, more risk-based approach of doing this, where you know that the things that you're doing to start with, like, those are the real things that someone's gonna do if they're coming after you, right? If someone is actually targeting you, these are what they're gonna be going after, and let's close those loops first. Again, rather than just trying to do that traditional, let's go patch the highs, let's go patch the criticals, and call it good. So, I think that leaves us probably like 5-10 minutes here for some questions. I don't know if there's any.
Yeah, any questions for Gary, please raise your hand, and I will get you a mic. For what it's worth, Gary, very much appreciate this talk. For what it's worth, we started our CPS journey not too long ago. Question?
Yeah. So my question is, how do you go about bringing the manufacturer of your process control network or whoever, how do you bring them to the table and negotiate with them on how to build in security into those contracts, or maintenance, or net new?
Yeah, so it does depend on your organization, right? Like, I always say your procurement folks should have a baseline. Like, I don't know the level of folks in this room, but if you're like in the C level or you're a VP or something like that, you should be talking with your procurement folks and say, like, here is the minimum what we should expect, right? And they should have to come back and redline us and say, like, if you're not gonna do simple things, right? Like, we can disable a default user account, right? We can disable unsecure protocols. We can do X, Y, Z, right? You should have a standard things that you've worked out with your procurement folks to try and do that. I will also say some of you guys are with the biggest companies on the planet, right? Like, some of these oil and gas companies are really, really big. You guys throw your weight around with lots of vendors all the time. I know you throw it around with clarity, right? You guys can use your weight, and these are things that I think you can do during that contract negotiation process. This is also something that I've seen come from industry. So again, I came from power, and when power started creating, like when NERC was coming along, when the nuclear regulations were coming along, we created industry groups. Like, you guys have these, you guys have the ONG ISAC, you guys have industry organizations where you can get together and try and push some of these objectives to say, like, our vendors need to be doing this stuff. And the only reason I always harp on this is they're not gonna do it unless they're getting that signal from their customers, right? And I've talked to these vendors and they're like, well, our customers aren't asking for security. They're not telling us we need to do, you know, blah, 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 these controls. We need to start encrypting stuff. We need to do whatever, right? They're not telling us that, and they need to get that signal from you guys that it is something that we need to be doing, right? It is something that we're gonna start expecting from our vendors to be doing. So, yeah.
Any other questions for Gary? Anybody? Nope.
Okay.
Gary, thank you.
Well, if no other questions, again, hopefully I've at least taught you, change your vulnerability mindset. Again, CVSS is not king. Go try something different. If you have questions, I'll be around for the rest of the conference, probably hanging out by the Clarity booth. But yeah, thank you for your time.